The war in Europe had ended, but no one felt entirely victorious. In 1945, General George S. Patton was at the pinnacle of public admiration. He was a symbol of American military power, a man whose audacity and results had won battles faster than anyone anticipated. Yet behind the headlines, the machinery of power was shifting quietly, and Patton found himself increasingly isolated in a landscape where victory no longer guaranteed influence. He had been a force of momentum, a general whose instincts demanded speed and decisiveness. But those same instincts now clashed with the emerging priorities of post-war Washington. The war had been about defeating Germany. The peace was about shaping a new world order. And in that transition, Patton was suddenly both essential and dangerous. He was cornered, his authority remained, but its scope was diminishing. His opinions were no longer just military assessments, they were political statements. Any hint that Patton distrusted Allied strategies, particularly in relation to the Soviets, was interpreted as a threat to the fragile balance of post-war negotiations. To challenge him directly would risk confrontation. To ignore him risked destabilizing an already precarious alliance. Pressure came from every direction. Political leaders in Washington were negotiating with allies whose loyalties were transactional and whose ambitions were vast. The British, concerned with rebuilding and maintaining influence, monitored Patton with caution. Soviet observers, aware of his reputation and outspoken nature, noted every word and gesture. And the American public, still captivated by the figure of Patton as a war hero, provided an invisible audience that could amplify any controversy. Patton's crisis was immediate and personal. One misstep, one ill-timed comment, and the consequences could ripple across continents. The alliance itself, which had survived years of combat through discipline and careful diplomacy, was at risk not from enemy fire, but from internal discord. The war had ended, but the politics of power were only beginning. The stakes were immense. This was not a disagreement over a military maneuver or the allocation of supplies. This was about authority, trust, and the legitimacy of decisions that would shape post-war Europe. A resignation, an insubordination, or a public clash could fracture the Allied command structure before the ink on victory had dried. Normal solution censure, private warnings, reassignment were insufficient. Patton's stature meant that any action against him would be scrutinized, interpreted, and politicized. To understand why this moment had arisen, one must trace the path Patton had traveled. His career had always been a mix of brilliance and controversy. He was celebrated for aggressive tactics, decisive action, and unflinching confidence. Yet those same traits had repeatedly brought him into conflict with superiors. His career was marked by reprimands, temporary sidelining, and restoration, all instances that reinforced his belief in his own strategic foresight. Each episode had taught him that speed, decisiveness, and clarity were undervalued when compared with caution, consensus, and diplomacy. His successes often validated his instincts, but they also cultivated enemies and suspicions. In wartime, his aggression was an asset. In peace, it was a liability. Past controversies lingered. British officers had always viewed Patton as reckless. Political figures in Washington had seen him as unpredictable. Even American generals who had fought alongside him recognized that his brilliance was inseparable from his ego. What had been tolerated as eccentricity during combat now appeared dangerous in the delicate post-war environment. The immediate trigger was less a single statement than a pattern of behavior. Patton repeatedly questioned the emerging occupation policies in Germany. He criticized the handling of Soviet forces. He implied that the West was ceding advantage out of convenience rather than necessity. These were not trivial remarks. They were assertions that political decisions were compromising strategic interests. The reactions were careful but unmistakable. His superiors began to circumscribe his influence. Discussions that once welcomed his input became curt and procedural. Instructions were couched in reminders of duty rather than explicit commands. The message was clear: the war was over, his role had changed, and his opinions now carried disproportionate political risk. Patton's response was predictable to anyone who understood him. He interpreted the silence not as control, but as confirmation. The lack of public pushback, the quiet restrictions, reinforced his belief that leaders were prioritizing convenience over clarity. He believed the Soviet Union was consolidating influence while the West hesitated, blinded by the desire for a smooth transition. Pressure around him intensified. Political leaders demanded restraint. Allies demanded stability. Media scrutiny was constant, ready to catch any deviation. Every word, every gesture, had amplified consequences. The walls closed in, invisible, but inescapable, shaping a crisis that would soon demand a decision. The impossible choice was taking shape. Leadership faced two paths: suppress Patton's influence to maintain alliance cohesion, or allow him to continue his warnings, risking diplomatic tension and political exposure. Neither path was safe. Each option threatened the reputation of the United States, the credibility of its leadership, and the stability of post-war Europe. Patton could not be fully restrained without appearing to punish a war hero unjustly. He could not be left unchecked without risking a public or political rupture. He was a figure whose visibility magnified any action taken against him. Decisions had to be surgical, precise, and, above all, silent. What followed was a compromise that would redefine Patton's career. He retained rank, visibility, and ceremonial authority. Operationally, however, his influence waned. His proximity to sensitive political matters ended. Decisions were taken without him, often after consultations that never included his perspective. The compromise resolved the immediate crisis, but left the underlying tension unresolved. This quiet sidelining had consequences. Patton's warnings went unheeded. Strategic insight was deferred. Trust shifted subtly, irrevocably. Allies and political leaders adjusted their expectations. The alliance remained intact, but its internal dynamics had changed permanently. Patton, once central, had become peripheral. Even as Europe stabilized, the cost of early dissent lingered. What had been ignored as impatience would later resonate as foresight. Yet by then, the moment to act decisively had passed. The compromise solved the present problem, but ensured that the next challenge would arrive without his voice fully engaged. The lesson was stark. In coalition politics, brilliance alone does not secure influence. Ego, timing, and perception are as decisive as strategy. Warnings delivered too soon, even when correct, can be silenced by necessity. Authority can be quietly removed without public confrontation. Trust can be preserved in appearance while eroding in practice. The war was over. Patton's career, for all its victories, was quietly constrained. The future he had anticipated was unfolding, but without him at the center. Power had shifted, alliances had endured, and one man's influence was diminished not by defeat, but by timing, politics, and the subtle mechanics of control. If you want to uncover more stories of military leaders whose decisions reshaped history, make sure to subscribe to the channel. More in-depth analyses of strategy, power, and post-war politics are coming. By the summer of 1945, the disagreement was no longer abstract. It had narrowed to a point of friction that could not be ignored. The war's conclusion had transferred authority from battlefield commanders to political leaders, and Patton struggled to accept the change. He believed strategy did not end with surrender. Others believed strategy now belonged elsewhere. The trigger was not a single outburst, but a convergence of moments that exposed how far Patton stood from the emerging consensus. As military governments took control of occupied Germany, Patton openly questioned the logic guiding the occupation. He objected to policies that, in his view, weakened administrative efficiency and empowered political considerations over stability. These remarks were not shouted. They were spoken plainly, without ornament. That was the problem. In the new environment, clarity itself was dangerous. Every assessment carried diplomatic weight. Every criticism implied opposition to decisions negotiated at the highest levels. Patton's comments, filtered through reports and second-hand accounts, landed in Washington stripped of nuance and framed as defiance. What he saw as professional disagreement was interpreted as resistance to civilian authority. The reaction was swift but quiet. Messages moved through channels that Patton did not control. Senior officers began to express concern, not about his competence, but about his reliability. Political advisors warned that Patton's posture complicated relations with allies whose cooperation was still required. The Soviet Union loomed in every calculation, an ally on paper and a rival in practice. What changed everything was the realization that Patton could not be corrected privately anymore. Previous controversies had been managed through reprimands and temporary sidelining. This time, the context was different. The United States was transitioning from wartime mobilization to global leadership. Stability mattered more than momentum. Predictability mattered more than brilliance. Pressure escalated rapidly. Political leaders feared that Patton's views, if made public, would undermine negotiations already in progress. Allied commanders worried that his presence complicated unified messaging. Journalists, sensing division beneath the surface of victory, began probing for signs of discord. Silence became impossible. Within the military hierarchy, discussions turned stark. Some argued Patton was being unfairly constrained, punished for insights others lacked the courage to voice. Others insisted that allowing him to continue would signal weakness in civilian oversight. The issue was no longer Patton's accuracy, but his compatibility with the system now governing power. Private conversations hardened, trust frayed. Officers who had once defended Patton began to distance themselves, not out of betrayal, but out of self-preservation. Aligning too closely with him risked professional isolation. The alliance required unity, even if that unity was maintained through omission rather than agreement. The situation grew claustrophobic. Options narrowed. A public confrontation would elevate Patton's warnings into a political crisis. Ignoring him risked emboldening dissent within the ranks. Removing him outright would provoke backlash at home and suspicion abroad. Every path carried consequences that extended far beyond one man. At the center of the dilemma stood President Harry Truman. He had inherited the war's end and the peace's uncertainty simultaneously. Unlike his predecessor, Truman had no long relationship with Patton, no personal history that softened judgment. What he saw was a general whose behavior threatened the careful balance required to manage victory. The impossible choice crystallized. Truman could preserve Patton's influence and risk diplomatic fallout, or curtail his authority to protect alliance stability. He could not do both. Maintaining Patton's role would suggest tolerance for dissent at a moment when cohesion was paramount. Removing him would signal that military prestige offered no immunity from political oversight. Every option failed someone. Keeping Patton intact risked emboldening critics of post-war policy. Restricting him risked alienating military leaders who valued independence. Public discipline risked controversy. Private sidelining risked resentment. There was no solution that preserved trust entirely. The decision, when it came, was calculated to appear administrative rather than punitive. Patton was reassigned. His role remained visible, but stripped of strategic weight. Official language emphasized routine rotation, the natural conclusion of wartime command. Unofficially, everyone understood the implication. His influence had ended. The compromise satisfied no one. Patton retained his rank, but not his voice. Political leaders avoided open conflict, but unresolved tensions remained. The alliance held, but at the cost of silencing dissent rather than resolving it. The crisis was solved, the problem endured. Patton's reaction was restrained, outwardly compliant. He did not resign, he did not rebel, but the change was unmistakable. Decisions no longer passed through him, his assessments no longer shaped policy. He had been removed from the arena where power was negotiated. The aftermath unfolded quietly. Patton continued his duties, but the energy that had defined his command dissipated. Those who once sought his counsel now avoided association. Trust, once eroded, did not return. The system had made its choice, and it would not revisit it. History would later debate whether Patton was right. At the time, that question was irrelevant. What mattered was that his presence complicated political survival. In coalition warfare, perception can outweigh foresight. Words spoken too early can be treated as threats rather than warnings. The long-term consequences were subtle but profound. Military leadership learned that post-war authority flowed downward from political consensus, not upward from battlefield success. Strategic debate became more cautious, more controlled. Lessons were absorbed, but selectively. Patton's career did not end with disgrace. It ended with distance. He was neither defeated nor vindicated. He was simply removed from relevance at the moment when relevance mattered most. The alliance moved forward, intact but altered. Decisions continued, shaped by compromise rather than confrontation. And one of the war's most aggressive commanders watched from the margins as the future he had warned about began to take form without his influence. The removal did not create headlines, that was the point. When Patton's authority was quietly narrowed, it was framed as routine, even administrative. The war had ended, commands were being reshuffled. Attention was shifting elsewhere. On paper, nothing dramatic had occurred. In practice, something fundamental had changed. Patton remained a general, but he was no longer a voice that mattered. Decisions about Germany's future moved forward without his input. Strategic discussions that once sought his perspective now bypassed him entirely. He was present, but absent from influence. Those around him noticed immediately. Officers who had relied on his judgment now kept their distance. Not out of hostility, but caution, association carried risk. The political environment had changed, and everyone understood it. Survival depended on alignment, not conviction. Patton did not publicly protest. He followed orders, he continued his duties. But the removal cut deeper than any formal reprimand. For a man whose identity was tied to command, exclusion was a kind of erasure. His authority had not been challenged on the battlefield, it had been withdrawn by consensus. The aftermath unfolded with deliberate calm. Washington avoided confrontation. Allied leaders avoided comment. The press moved on. What had been neutralized was not a man, but a problem. Trust did not return. Once Patton had been identified as politically inconvenient, his future was sealed. There would be no return to prominence, no restored command. The system rarely reverses decisions made for stability. It simply moves forward without those left behind. The long-term consequences reached far beyond Patton himself. The message to the military was unmistakable. In the post-war world, strategic insight mattered less than political discipline. Victory on the battlefield no longer guaranteed a seat at the table where peace was shaped. Officers learned to speak carefully. Opinions became measured, conditional, delayed. Warnings were softened or withheld entirely. The alliance demanded cohesion, and cohesion required restraint. The cost was not immediate, but it was real. As relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated, Patton's earlier concerns resurfaced in quieter forms. Analysts, diplomats, and planners began grappling with realities that had once been dismissed as premature, but by then, the decisions had been made. Lines had been drawn, structures had hardened. History would later debate whether Patton had been right. That debate misses the point. Accuracy was never the deciding factor. Timing was. In coalition warfare, Being correct too early can be more dangerous than being wrong. Patton did not live to see how the world he warned about fully emerged. He died without vindication, without reconciliation, without restoration. His career did not end in disgrace, but in irrelevance. For someone like Patton, that was the harshest outcome imaginable. The alliance endured. That was the priority. It survived the war and carried forward into an uneasy peace. But it did so by narrowing the range of acceptable voices, by choosing silence over friction. Those choices shaped the post-war order as much as any treaty. What was lost was not just Patton's position, but a kind of candor. A willingness to confront uncomfortable possibilities before they became unavoidable. The system preserved itself, but at the cost of foresight. This is how power often operates at the highest levels. Not through dramatic confrontations, but through quiet exclusions. Careers end not with accusations, but with reassignment. Influence disappears not through defeat, but through consensus that someone has become inconvenient. The decision that ended Patton's career was not driven by malice. It was driven by necessity, as leaders understood it at the time. But necessity has consequences, and those consequences rarely announce themselves. They unfold slowly, shaping futures long after the original decision fades from memory. The war was won, the peace was managed. But something else was lost forever. If you value serious history that looks beyond battles and into the psychology of power, leadership, and consequence, consider subscribing to the channel. These are the stories that explain not just how wars are fought, but how the world that follows is shaped.